If you watch one video this year about solo mists in Albion Online, this should be that video. For you, for me, and for the vast majority of Albion players, when it comes to mists specifically, going in tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9 equivalent gear will not only be the most fun PvP, but also the most profitable. So let's talk first about what makes a good mid-tier build for solo PvP in the mists, and then go over the top 25 weapon options that you have to actually be successful, have fun, get better at the game, and make a lot of profits. Now, solo PvP in Albion is balanced around the idea that every build needs to make decisions between, on one hand, having mobility or kiting tools, and on the other hand, damage or brawling tools. And the weapons that become the most successful of all the 100+ weapons we have are the ones that are able to get the best of both worlds, that are able to increase their mobility and kiting without sacrificing their ability to do damage, or the other way around, become very good brawlers and damage dealers without sacrificing too much in terms of their mobility. The key aspect determining the success of a build or a weapon when we're talking about going into the mists in mid-tier is fight selection. And I don't mean this in the sense that having game knowledge to know which fights to select is important. It obviously is. But when we're talking about ranking weapons, fight selection means having the tools in your build in order to actually enforce the selection that you've made on the rest of the world. What I mean by this is not just choosing which fights, but being able to force people into the fights that you want and avoid the fights that you don't want. Now, on one side of this coin, being able to force people into fights, we have things like dismounting, like being able to catch people who are trying to get away and finish the kills after you have enough of an advantage in a fight. And on the other side of the coin, we have tools to be able to defend yourself when you are forced in a fight that you did not want initially, as well as tools or spells in order to create space and potentially disengage or reset from a bad fight. Fight selection alone, of course, is not enough. You need to not only be able to choose the fights, but also to actually win the fights that you are choosing. Note that comparing to low tier budget builds, when we're talking about going in mid tier, so tier 7, tier 8 and tier 9, then some of the things change a little bit. Number one, PvE becomes less important. The higher up you go in IP, the less relevant it will be how good your weapon will be in PvE. The only place where it still kind of will matter is how fast you're able to farm up stacks in the Nightfall Abbey dungeons. The second thing that changes a bit is that if we looked at low IP builds, then it was fine for a lot of builds to completely disregard their survival and sacrifice all mobility and kiting just to be the good brawler and have some chance of getting that ultra big payday kill. When you're going in mid tier, death actually starts costing and adds up if you die a lot, meaning that you can no longer completely go full brawl and you need to have some tools to actually survive and get out of bad situations. So with these things in mind, let's look at the 4 S tier weapons that we currently have for going into the mists in tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9. The number one weapon on our list today, unfortunately, is not a huge surprise. There is one weapon which for quite a long time in the mists has been able to do almost everything. Has been able to lean into mobility without sacrificing damage, to be a very good brawler without sacrificing mobility, and that is the carving sword. The carving sword comes with some phenomenal flexibility. It is naturally great and maybe even the best at dismounting, catching and sticking to enemies when you have an advantage. And if you are in a defensive position or you want to avoid a fight, it is equally powerful. You're able to do consistent damage while kiting away from a stronger opponent. The fact that it's a sword means that it comes with very multifunctional Q and W. The Q is great at sticking to targets as well as using it for mobility to get away, as well as making it a very strong brawler. The W splitting slash comes with the same kind of functionalities. You can use it to get away, you can use it to catch people, or simply to damage or to execute someone through Undead Cave. All swords share these strengths, but carving takes it to a next level by offering good, almost instant mobility on its E as well as decent damage. Because of this flexibility, the carving sword can fight anybody in the mists. Even its worst matchups, like some turret builds or spears, usually end up being somewhere around 50-50 fights at equal IP. On top of this, there are no clear weaknesses that require specific items to solve, allowing the carving to freely adapt their item usage to the situation. And the biggest thing is that carving sword does everything while remaining very simple to play. This doesn't mean that there isn't a high skill ceiling. You can still do amazing plays with the weapon, but you can pretty much be successful without even knowing that there are other Q or W options, or without ever changing any items in your build. So we have a simple weapon that is very good at dismounting, forcing fights, as well as finishing kills when it has an advantage, but also performs well when it needs to get away, space, or just simply defend itself against higher IP attackers. It can take advantage of multi-way PvP scenarios as a rat or to get away from rats, and it does all of that in a relatively simple way. The only two small drawbacks of playing carving is number one, that it is and has been the most popular weapon already for a while, so you're never really gonna surprise anyone, meaning that everybody, even beginners in the mists, will know what you're trying to do and how your spells work, and so they will often dodge your splitting slashes, expect your E's, and so on. And secondly, every now and then, if you kill someone on carving, be ready for these kinds of messages. Let's keep going. Next up in our S tier are Death Givers. Death Givers once again excel at being able to attack, to dismount, and catch players that are trying to get away so as to force your fight selection or weaker enemies. And remember, we're not just talking about weaker enemies in the sense of 300 IP difference. We're talking about people who are the same tier but are maybe losing a fight or are just simply afraid. Death Givers as a dagger has very good tools to catch up and stay on top of those enemies. On the other hand, Death Givers also packs a decent punch to surprise some higher IP attackers. I mentioned this earlier in my video about low IP builds, and this still holds true when you go in mid tier. Death Givers have access to Sunder Armor and Chain Slash, which turns them into potentially one of the best brawlers in the mists. If Carving Sword, for example, generally tries to brawl kiters and kite brawlers, the Death Givers approach is often to catch kiters and brawl them, but then brawl the brawlers even harder. One big plus of this weapon is just how much pressure it can put on an enemy, even a higher tier one. It's quite simple to make one critical mistake against Death Givers and there's no coming back, and you might just die. If they get 3 stacks and you are no longer have the tools to kite them, that's it. However, unlike the Carving Sword, the Death Givers depend and are much more reliant on their Q and W spells and being able to choose them for every situation. Which means that, first of all, you need a couple seconds to switch to the correct spells, and secondly, good thinking opponents will sometimes be able to take advantage of the specific Qs and Ws you've selected. But even in those fights, Death Givers usually still have a lot of nice outplay potential. In part because they, as a dagger, also have 2 Ws which give them an iframe, giving them additional tools to completely turn around the fight or get away from a bad situation. It's a fun weapon which can approach PvP with a lot of different builds, a lot of different ideas and strategies, and makes mists more fun for everyone, and in its current state is absolutely an S tier pick for mid-level PvP. Our next S tier weapon is the Daybreaker. Daybreaker sacrifices a tiny bit of being able to select its fights the way it wants for the sake of having the tools to counter absolutely everybody. By far the biggest thing putting Daybreaker in S tier is having access to a low cooldown purge on its E, which also doubles as a mobility option as well as potential immunity to CC if timed correctly. Purge is by far the most flexible thing that you can have at your disposal in solo PvP, allowing you to approach every single fight with some potential outplay and some potential tools. If you need to catch someone or get away from someone, purge their boots. If you need to win a brawl or to counter some specific stack-based weapon, purge their stacks or purge their Inferno shield. There are so many possibilities that the Daybreaker brings with its E, and it's on a 25-second cooldown. So the two biggest things behind the rise of Daybreaker and why we find it in S tier on this list is number one, the purge, which I just talked about, but secondly, how good it is at countering other builds and specifically how good it is at working against Mist's meta. Being a spear, the Daybreaker has a lot of flexibility to adapt to every situation and counter every opponent, but it specifically works well against the two things that we see most of in the Mists. Number one, builds that are trying to use and abuse mobility advantages, because the Daybreaker is great at catching kiters and catching people who try to reset fights. And secondly, swords. If a sword wants to brawl, Daybreaker can cripple their stacks and kite them with Qs. If a sword wants to kite, then the Daybreaker has the tools to catch and force the sword into a brawl and is good enough brawler to actually win most brawls. There are, however, three minor drawbacks to keep in mind. Number one is that the Daybreaker's flexibility depends a lot on its ability to choose a W spell and even change its helmet. Because the basic build with the Duskweaver helmet that I'm sure you've seen is great at catching kiters, but not so useful against brawlers, and so it's relatively important comparing to carving or deathgivers. It's more important for a Daybreaker to have the ability to have a second helmet and switch to it for a brawl, or miss out on some potential opportunities. The second little drawback is how bad Daybreaker is at dismounting compared to some of the other options we mentioned. And finally, how quickly it has risen into the meta over the last 3 or 4 months also makes for a bit of a situation where a lot of people will refuse to fight the Daybreaker even when they could easily do that, just because they feel that they don't know the matchup or that they are going to be countered in that matchup. But these are rather small things, and regardless of that, the Daybreaker is so strong at being able to handle every single fight and specifically good at countering other meta builds that it deserves a nice place in our S tier today. And so this leaves us with one more spot on the S tier of mid-level meta weapons. And if you want to guess which weapon that is, the hint is to refer back to what we just talked about in regards to having a built-in purge. On the list at number 4 are the Fists of Avalon. There are 3 key aspects which make the Fists of Avalon one of the best weapons for solo Mists. Number 1, it packs a very serious burst of damage. In general, having a burst is preferable to having slow and steady DPS because your enemy is less able to react to it and you're more likely to be able to surprise and catch people off guard. And this is useful both in the situation where you are the aggressor attacking someone who might not want to take the fight or is losing, as well as when you are forced to defend yourself against a higher IP player. Secondly, the Fists of Avalon also have a built-in purge, like we talked about earlier with the Daybreaker, which is, as we talked about, incredibly flexible, allowing you to decide what the situation needs and purge accordingly, but also means that you're actually able to do the burst damage that you have, as you are able to get rid of a lot of defensives that some of your enemies might rely upon. Having access to gloves, Qs and Ws, Fists of Avalon also have some of the best mobility of all the popular Mist builds, meaning that it is very possible for you to just keep poking and keep trying to start a good fight, and if it doesn't go your way, just reset and get away from a bad situation and then come back and try again until it is your enemy that makes a mistake, after which you're able to most likely catch up and finish the job. And even though Fists of Avalon are regularly played strictly as a burst, then kite, then burst again type of weapon, it does have access to some interesting W and Q options, allowing it in the hands of a very experienced and specialized player to also become even a little bit brawly, or at the very least a very flexible weapon choice with things like fleet footwork on Q, or choosing between things like devastating combo or triple kick on its W. The only thing holding this weapon back a little bit is that the E is very slow. And that means that it gives your enemies time to either dodge it if they have boots on, or react to it. And the biggest pain is one of the most popular jackets in all of the Mists, the Mistwalker jacket, which is a bit too strong of a counter against Fists of Avalon to be reliably outplayed. Fists of Avalon absolutely excel at fight selection. It's a weapon that is able to meaningfully participate in all kinds of different PvP situations in the Mists. And even among S tier weapons, it is probably the most difficult to catch and punish. Let's move on to the A tier, where we have once again 4 weapons that are all quite well equipped to handle different types of situations that come up in the Mists if you go in tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9. And the first one in this category is going to be Dual Swords. A weapon that I talked about when discussing low IP builds. It still maintains a lot of the same benefits even when you go a little bit higher up. The 3 big benefits that it has is number 1, its potential for big upset victories against higher IP players, which is still a relevant part of your strategy even if you go in mid-level. Secondly, the fact that it's a sword and benefits from a lot of what we discussed with carving of very flexible Q and W that dual swords can use in all kinds of different ways depending on the situation. And finally, the big last benefit is just how much pressure dual swords is able to put out relatively simply. Simply by clicking all of its buttons, it puts the ball in the court of your opponent, so to speak, who now has to react and figure out how to deal with this constant barrage. But inevitably, as you go higher and higher in IP, dual swords start losing their edge a little bit, because more and more players around you will have the tools to deal with your damage and your pressure. Some of these tools will come in the form of mobility. A lot of builds will be able to reset the fight until you make a mistake by missing an E or wasting your jacket or something like that. Some of the builds will have good tools to dodge your E, since it is pretty telegraphed. In yet other situations, the E can also be reflected or dodged with things like Mistwalker jacket or soldier helmet and so on. And the result of all this is that while dual swords are able to often put a lot of pressure on the opponent, and there is potential for that big kill against even much more expensive build, if the enemy does play their cards right, it's often pretty impossible to win the fight. Unlike carving sword, duels do not really have the potential to constantly do damage while kiting away, because you need to decide whether you E into your enemy or away from them, essentially. Despite all this, it remains a sword, and it remains a strong weapon to take on a lot of different situations and potentially bake some big profit as a mid-tier option. Next up, we have one of the most fun weapons in all of Albion, the one-handed spear. The one-handed spear is an incredibly flexible weapon, having the tools to solve pretty much every different situation. There are no real bad matchups for the spear. There is always some room for outplay, even in difficult situations and against difficult opponents. And if you cannot win a fight, you also have decent tools to get away or kite your enemy. One big benefit for the spear in the Mists is how it absolutely excels in all of those unorthodox PvP situations that are not simply a duel, but 5-way fights on a chest, or being ratted and then ratting back, or all kinds of other 2 fights happening at the same time on the same screen type of things that we all run into, especially if you're going into the Mists in those middling tiers. Although it is noticeably weaker at straight up brawling than the Daybreaker, it still features a lot of the same benefits that we discussed earlier, notably that it counters decently well many of the meta builds that rely on being able to abuse mobility or that are swords. On top of this, it can realize its potential and effectiveness even with a very cheap build. Which means that if you consistently go into the mists with tier 7 or tier 8, then your deaths will be much less costly than on the S tier weapons we discussed earlier, opening you up to taking advantage of more risks and more different types of situations while still remaining profitable despite dying. There are two drawbacks to the spear putting it in A tier, however. Number one, it is very bad at dismounting. If you remember, forcing fights and your fight selection is a part of success, and the spear, while able to catch and also get away from many situations, is horrible at forcing mounted enemies into fighting. And secondly, the spear, while being kind of good at everything and incredibly flexible, does not excel at any one thing. So if your opponents who are specialized in specific playstyles are able to drag you into their type of fight, so let's say a Frost Staff is able to kite you, or a Dual Swords is able to force you to brawl, then you're most likely not going to win. Next up in A tier, and I am really happy to finally be able to rank this weapon relatively high. We have the Bow of Badon. Badon has benefited greatly from some recent buffs, some of them direct to its E as well as to bows in general, and some of them indirect. Since the hypermobility Stalker Jacket meta has kind of died out, it's much easier to be a kiter in the mists and you're not gonna be caught by absolutely everyone. And because of all that, the Bow of Badon is finally back where it belongs. There are two big notable things putting it in our A tier today. Number one, the versatility of its E. It, unlike other bows, can be used for a lot of very different ways. You can use the Bow of Badon E as an extra spacing tool to create a couple meters between you and your enemy and keep kiting. You can also use it as an interrupt for against some spellcasters, for specific spells, or to completely destroy some fire staffs, for example. You can also use it to finish off enemies. And finally, it also gives Bow of Badon some potential as a brawling weapon. This means that just like all the other weapons we've discussed, Badon comes equipped with the tools to handle a lot of very different types of PvP situations in the mists when going in tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9. And the second notable highlight putting Badon so high on our tier list is its very high effective range. Because of the buff to Deadly Shot Q and its E also having decent enough range, Badon can be very effective from far, putting pressure on enemies to close the distance. However, there are also two clear drawbacks that are kind of holding it back from becoming S tier at the moment. First of all, it is very difficult and unforgiving, because it is your job on the Badon in most matchups to be responsible for maintaining space. And this is not always simple. I've said this before, kiting is always a little bit more difficult than catching, and you have to be really precise with your Frost Shot and your other kiting tools. While hypermobility is not really as popular as it used to be, there's still a lot of strong meta builds that will catch and punish you if you make a mistake. And the second little drawback of Badon is that while it does this better than other bows, it still struggles a little bit in finishing off kills once you have won a fight or have enough of an advantage, because of the space that you have maintained and the fact that your enemy can often just turn around and run away. Overall, it's a difficult but very fun A tier weapon in the mists today. And our final A tier resident today is the light crossbow. This is another weapon that thrives in the middling tiers of the mists, being able to take advantage and have potential in all kinds of very different PvP situations. However, the single biggest argument or biggest benefit putting it this high on our tier list is the sheer amount of damage that it is able to output if played well. And this damage is not only potentially surprising, but also gives it some very good possibilities to take down much stronger targets. When you're playing mid-tier crossbow, it's likely that the majority of your profits will come from occasionally beating much more expensive opponents by baiting them in and killing them with your overwhelming damage output. Having access to caltrops on W means that it also has a good tool to kite away while maintaining damage, as well as potentially chase down some kills to finish a fight. There are two notable drawbacks to light crossbow though. Number one is that it is very difficult, both mechanically as well as tactically. You need to be good at hitting your spells, keep track of what's happening in the fight, as well as to use your defensives correctly in order to bait in your enemies and potential kills. In fact, how good you are at baiting in enemies is probably going to be the biggest single determining factor of your success on the light crossbow and middling tiers. And that is because its second drawback is that it will often run into mobility issues against other meta mist builds. This can be somewhat mitigated with caltrops and royal boots, but it means that oftentimes playing a crossbow can feel a bit like that low IP wildfire, where you would like to fight all kinds of people, but they just run away because they have no interest to risk their more expensive gear against your potentially devastating damage. On the plus side though, you don't really need to change your spells or your items to be kind of ready to handle different types of mist situations. And this concludes our A tier. Okay, let's speed this up a little bit and move on to B tier, where we have 8 very good weapons when going in the mists in tier 7, 8 or 9. All of these weapons have big potential to be very successful, especially if you become a good specialist with one of the builds. However, all of these also have some significant drawbacks which make them a little bit more situational and slightly less consistent as long-term successful strategies. But if you like any of these weapons, you should absolutely play them and you will be doing very well in the mists. So let's go. First up, in B tier, we have Battle Bracers. This is a weapon that absolutely excels at fight selection. It has one of the highest mobility of all the weapons we've discussed so far, even more than its brother Fists of Avalon due to its shorter cooldown E. However, a relatively big drawback of this weapon is that the E does not come with a built-in purge and can be reacted to or even interrupted. This means that all the reflexes are a pain, all the different dashes to dodge or ways to interrupt it, like one-handed spear or even a firewall, can be devastating for Battle Bracers. However, Battle Bracers do come with a lot of tools to handle different situations, to be successful in multi-way PvP, as well as to outplay a lot of opponents in 1v1 fights. This means that you can often take advantage of enemies' mistakes, and if they don't make any, well, you will just keep running around the mist, hoping to find another opportunity. Next up, the one-handed fire. This is a weapon that shines at lower IP, but once you go higher up, just like we talked about dual swords, opponents will have more and more tools and will also have more experience to deal with one-handed fire. This weapon at middling tiers resembles the light crossbow, but struggles even more with fight selection. Having no meaningful consistent tools to force people into fights or get away from bad situations, you're kind of reliant on either baiting them in or trying to solve your issues with things like royal boots. However, it's a weapon that still packs a significant punch and gives you that potential if you get lucky or if you bait successfully to get those big kills and potentially outplay much more expensive geared opponents. As you go with higher IP and start swapping out your Q1 for Q3, you also become, provided you can hit your Qs, you become a very meaningful threat that can do a lot of damage even to opponents who might have more mobility or be able to outplay you otherwise. Next up, we have the Chill Hull. This is a weapon with one of the highest skill ceilings in all of solo PvP, rivaling with Deathgiver's Spear and some of the ones we've talked about earlier. Just like the Bow of Badon, the Chill Hull has benefited a lot from the fact that the hypermobility builds have been nerfed and kiting is kind of possible again as a strategy for the mists. The Chill Hull offers a variety of tools to deal with all kinds of different matchups and different PvP situations. The outplay potential with a well-timed blink or a good usage of the E is absolutely incredible. However, all of those different approaches to PvP in the end still look kind of like different flavors of kiting. And this means a couple things for the Chill Hull. Number one, you need to be precise, and it's much easier for you to make a mistake than for the sword player trying to catch you. Number two, it also means that fights will often take long, allowing for more rats to take part in the fight. And if you do get the advantage, just like with the bows that we discussed earlier, it's not always that simple to turn the fight around and start chasing and finish the kill. It's a solid B tier option, especially if you're looking for a weapon to feel the rewards of having outplayed your opponents rather than to see all the rewards in your bank. Next up, continuing with B tier, we have a weapon which is very difficult to rank when talking about tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9, and that is Infinity Blade. Infinity Blade benefits from everything we talked about swords, from its Q and W, but also packs an amazing and almost unrivaled potential for brawling because of its possibility to choose an offhand, because of the way its E works. It can pretty much just stay on top of people and out-brawl them. In fact, if we were just simply comparing weapons and their potential in 1v1 fights, Infinity Blade might very well have made the S tier. But the big thing why we find it in B tier is the cost. When we are comparing long-term mist strategies and specifically talking about mid-tiers, you have to accept that you're going to die. And that's fine, and that's part of the game. But if every time you die, your weapon alone costs twice as much as most of the other builds that we've been discussing so far, that drawback is too big to ignore it essentially. SBI has successfully created this deficit of crystal weapons, which has made Infinity Blade extremely expensive and not necessarily always worth the investment if you go into the mists in tier 7, 8 or 9. Next up, in B tier, we have the Battle Axe. Battle Axe suffers a little bit from similar problems like dual swords or one-handed fire, which is that the higher IP you go, the more people you will encounter who will have the tools to counter you, and most notably different mobility options in order to essentially not let you kill them or not let you take that good brawl, which is what Battle Axe really shines at. Another drawback is that it is not that simple to hit all your E's, especially against good thinking players. However, Battle Axe still shines as a great weapon when you do successfully manage to lock someone down for a brawl, as well as give you that big, potentially surprising sustain from the double E, as well as Merc Jacket if you're using that, which means that finishing off a Battle Axe for your enemy is also a little bit difficult and there's always risks involved. If you get really good at hitting your E's, you can even kind of make it work as a cloth armor big damage build, giving you another option to potentially solve many PvP situations. Next up, in B tier, we have the Tomb Hammer. This is a weapon that really shines more with an IP advantage, being able to abuse its mobility and very long stun from far to catch and kite around enemies until they are whittled down enough for you to finish the job. However, if you become a bit of a specialist with the build, it can be very effective already at middling tiers, even potentially against same IP opponents. Catching and punishing a good Tomb Hammer player is almost impossible, which means that you are able to kind of prod and poke until your enemy makes enough mistakes for you to go on the aggressive. Finishing the kill once you are on the aggressive can be a bit challenging though without that IP advantage. And similarly to the Chill Hull we just talked about, Tomb Hammer fights will usually last so long that there's a high probability that there will be other players who will get involved. However, with the Tomb Hammer you have good tools to still manage to solve the PvP situation and either be the last one standing or at least survive and not lose your equipment. Next up we have another weapon which, similarly to some of the S tier options we discussed, has a built-in purge. And not only is it built in, but it also has amazing range. And that is the Life Curse Staff. I feel that this is a weapon that hasn't fully been figured out yet, with different new build ideas surfacing every now and then, and the latest iteration with the Duskweaver helmet and potentially even Shoes of Tenacity actually seem to be pretty successful in Mists when going in mid-tier. Life Curse takes advantage of the crazy potential sustained damage if it's able to keep its curse stacks on the enemy. And this makes it into a potentially impossible fight for a lot of different builds, and hence gives it a good amount of enemies and situations that it can be profitable in. However, just like with all other curse staffs, there are some specific counters and some ways to play around it, which can also make some fights almost impossible for the Life Curse. Unlike other curse staffs though, it comes with a built-in purge, which can be incredibly useful, just like we talked with Daybreaker or Fists of Avalon, giving a lot of potential outplay options to purge different things based on the situation, and also prevent from enemies using their mobility advantage to get away. And finally, to round up our B tier today, we will have the One-Handed Dagger. This is a weapon that shines at mid tiers because, similar to some other weapons we've discussed today, like Light Crossbow, Dual Swords, Fire Staff, it has an almost unmatched potential to take down much stronger, more expensive players. And this makes it for a pretty good weapon for going into the Mists, accepting that you're gonna die here and there, but more than making up for those deaths with some amazing outplay kills when you're able to handle your opponent's defensives, and most likely with your second E rotation, just flat out kill them. As a dagger with Shadow Edge, it also has a decent tool to catch up and finish opponents that are trying to get away. However, the One-Handed Dagger itself struggles a bit when it comes to trying to get away from attackers or fights and situations that it does not like. And what knocks it down to B tier very clearly is how horrible it can feel in those multi-way or non-standard PvP situations. And this concludes our B tier. Let's now very quickly go over some of the weapons which definitely deserve to be on the list, but have made it only to C tier currently, as options to go in tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9 into the Mists. First of all, the One-Handed Frost, which almost makes it to B tier and is very similar to Chill Howl in both its playstyle as well as the kind of tools that it offers for you to solve PvP situations. However, even though it is simpler to play, the fact that its E is much easier to counter and offers you less abilities to get rid of those chasers, such as swords or potential daybreakers and all those other things we've discussed so far, means that it's more likely that you will be in a situation where good enemies will catch and kill you, and weaker enemies will still be able to get away from you after you've successfully kited them for a little while. The Prowling Staff is not in the best place right now after all the nerfs to it directly as well as to shapeshifters in general. However, it still gives enough tools to outplay opponents and to be able to win a lot of 1v1s if you are a real specialist with the build. The potential of big execute damage is still there, so if you're somehow able to bait out your opponent's defensives and get them low enough, you might get a pretty nice kill on a Prowling. The invisibility can also come really handy to get away from sticky situations. Next up, the Bloodletter. Now, the Stalker Jacket Bloodletter is almost dead, at least for mid-tier PvP options, since you really need a big IP advantage to make it work. However, it does still offer some of the benefits that I discussed when talking about low IP options, and hence still makes our tier list in C tier. It's possible to take advantage of multi-way PvP situations, and it's even possible to outplay some opponents, potentially even using cloth armor for extra damage by dodging a lot of their spells and kind of jumping in and out of fights, but requires a lot more skill than it used to before the Stalker Jacket and the Bloodletter nerfs. Next up, Great Hammer, a kind of a similar situation that as the Bloodletter, requires an IP advantage or at least a very good awakened weapon with cooldown reduction to really maximize what the Great Hammer can bring. As for mid-tier options, it still offers good enough choices to solve some PvP situations and get some kills here and there, while being very difficult to punish due to its overwhelming mobility and slows, or stuns even if you E or W through your enemy. However, it's going to be a lot of running around and not being able to kill people for the hopes of occasionally hitting the jackpot, most likely. Next up, the one-handed Arcane is still a very interesting choice, and one where if you become a specialist, you can make it look like an A-tier weapon. It has a lot of tools to outplay different types of opponents and adapt itself to the matchup, because once again, like we talked about some weapons before, it has a built-in purge, which is very powerful. And the silence effect of its E also can be incredibly useful. However, just like with low IP, Arcane, it comes with a lot of difficulty of execution. You need to be quite precise and kind of still requires you to be able to bait higher or more expensive opponents to occasionally die for the Arcane to be profitable long term, because it does not excel at fight selection, not having amazing mobility to catch and finish kills or to force people into fights or even to get away from those higher IP attackers. Next up, another weapon which can look amazing at the hands of a specialist, but we don't have a lot of those specialists, and that is the Quarterstaff. The Quarterstaff has tools for both fight selection as well as a lot of burst damage to surprise and kill attackers with more expensive higher IP gear, but it cannot really do both, so it does have to choose its Q and W based on the situation, and it's a good example of what I talked at the very beginning of the video of having to balance between mobility or damage. And whichever way you choose, the Quarterstaff has enough benefits to put it in our C tier today. Next up, the Hellspawn Staff. Also suffering a bit from nerfs to shapeshifters, the Hellspawn still remains a potential weapon for big upsets. Kind of like a thinking man's boltcasters, if you will, a weapon which, if you outplay your opponent, you're able to overcome even pretty difficult situations, but suffers from the fact that a lot of opponents will have decent tools and understanding of the fight to deal with the big potential damage that the Hellspawn Staff can offer. Especially with Polymorph being more difficult to hit now, the Hellspawn belongs in C tier for a good specialist, but is difficult to make successful long term for mid-tier PvP. Next up, we have the Claymore. Claymore benefits from being a sword and can use its Q and W very successfully depending on the specific situation and what it requires. However, the Claymore E, while potentially devastating in the right circumstances, is a little bit too easy for most meta builds to play around by either purging the stacks or making or forcing the Claymore to use their E simply as a mobility option, negating the big damage that it can bring. And the final weapon on our list today in C tier are Boltcasters. This is a weapon which excels at taking down higher IP targets that make mistakes and become too aggressive, but suffers from a lot of the problems we've discussed already with dual swords, one-handed fire, and all those big burst or big brawl weapons that as you go higher in IP, your opponents will be better and better at dealing with. However, Boltcaster still is worthy of making the list because of the sheer amount of damage that it can put out, making it often possible to take a fight normally, and even though you are losing the fight, suddenly on your last 10% H or 20% HP to activate that E, potentially with some damage buffs, and shred your enemy and surprise them with a nice payday for you. And that's it for this monster of a video. I hope that you've gained some new understanding and ideas for the mists. I know that there are a lot more viable weapons than just 25, and if you're enjoying one which is not on the list, that's great for you, and it means that you found something that is really fun for you in Albion Online PvP. However, it is these weapons that we talked about that are most likely going to be consistently profitable and successful in the mists if you're going there with tier 7, tier 8 or tier 9, which for the majority of us is where the most fun, most PvP and most silver is going to happen. If you enjoy the PvP aspect of Albion Online, don't forget to subscribe, and I will be very happy to see you in the next video. Until then, have an amazing time out there, enjoy the mists or open world or whatever it is that is your jam, and have fun with your life. Goodbye.